Good, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I've learned a lot yesterday and this morning, and it's not over. So it's time to give something back. I was also very pleased yesterday to hear that we share a lot of concerns on sustainability, but also concerns on the practice of engineering and design. How do we combine hardware and software? How do we combine especially infrastructure and space, and how do we turn infrastructure into space of living, space of inhabitability? My intervention today concerns a very specific aspect of water and sustainable water management, and this is the question of flooding, how flood is integrated into large-scale urban planning and landscape planning. I am myself a landscape architect, but I've in the past worked also at an urban scale in Holland, in France. I've been teaching at the ETH Zurich in the mountains, and I am now working in Strasbourg at the School of Architecture in the second capital of Europe, which is along the Rhine, so along one of the biggest European rivers. Like we've seen yesterday in the European tradition, flood is mostly associated with catastrophe, and especially in the biblical dimension, and that's, I guess, common to all the Western society. Flood is bad, flood is dangerous, flood should be avoided. This actually wasn't always the case, also in Europe. What you can see here, or could we dim the light a little bit so that the slides are a bit legible? Is it possible to dim the light a little bit? What you see here is a map, is a digital terrain model of the north of the Netherlands. Well, I guess it's still legible. What you see here is a terrain model, digital terrain model of the north of the Netherlands. And just by changing with the settings, what you see appearing are all these little dots here. These little puckles, sorry. These little dots are actually very small hills. And some of these hills are actually 2,000 years old. So they were actually built before Christianity. And these little hills were built to put the farms and to put the houses and to put villages. And we had a full society there living with actually flood and not living against flooding. And actually the floods were even used for fishery to benefit from the tides. And this civilization was wiped out by history, but still there are examples in Europe of living with flood and actually using floods. And yet, especially since the Middle Age and the Renaissance, the idea of control and of full control has become the motto of river management. God had given the earth to the children of men. That was in the Bible, so somehow we got it as a present. We were allowed to do whatever we want with it. Buffon, the French naturalist, in the 18th century, wrote that man was, and he thought more of men than women, of course, at the time, that man was the most perfect animal. So, and the engineers of the same time were writing that the man was master and dominator of the planet. That's literally in the philosophy books of the 18th century and 19th century. And that's also the time when all the European rivers were transformed from very wide foresty environment to straight channels. Here you see a little segment of the Rhine River near Strasbourg, which was straightened according to the plans made by engineer Johann Tüller from Karlsruhe. And Tüller actually wrote what he was going to do, and he wrote, every river or stream needs only one bed, and if it has several arms, one should work towards a narrowed stream, and it should be kept as straight as possible. That was his program, almost a political program, and his program was actually applied, as you see, on 200 kilometers of Rhine River, with as a result that the Rhine area, the upper Rhine area, has become one of the richest in Europe. But also that the Rhine River has lost about 80% of its original forest, and that the floodplain, which used to be about 15 kilometers wide, is now down to 150 meters. And that's a major problem today. But controlling water was still a motto and an obsession and controlling nature in general until at least the 70s and the 80s. It was also an obsession in my family. You see here my grandfather, actually, Marcel, and he's standing on a dam in the Alps, and he was very proud, like everybody in the Alps, very proud of being able to control this nature which was pretty harsh, pretty difficult to live with. And thanks to these control works, the Alpine valleys in France, in Switzerland, or in Germany could be turned from riverine valley into hyper-productive and hyper-inhabited valley. There's only 150 years difference between these two pictures, which in European time is not much. You see the city of Grenoble here. You see the river Isère, who is just flowing through the valley and changing course at every flood. And what you see is also that all the villages are implemented on the sites on the foothill, and all the main roads are also implemented, constructed on the foothill. This is the situation today. Grenoble has gone from about 10,000 inhabitants to 500,000, and has basically invaded the whole valley, and you could almost go until Geneva. You would have the same situation. And this is now the situation we are left with. Most of us living in floodplains, living in places that have been made dangerous, where we are not capable anymore to live with fluctuations. And we are left a bit between the illusions of easy solutions, the illusions of denial, like let's not just think about it, let's not just think about rising sea level, and let's just keep on building on the coast. And the fear, very deep fear, which is somehow goes back to biblical fear, and 2012 actually didn't happen, so we're glad. The film was made in 2009, but it was propagating this kind of very deep fear that we will not be able to control the nature anymore very soon. And luckily, there has been a turn in history in Europe at the turn of a millennium. And the turn was, to sum it up, was that keeping on controlling and petrifying the landscape was not sustainable, and that we had to bring water management back into the realm of urban planning and of spatial planning. But it was a question of space and not just a question of cubic meter per second to go through a channel or through a pipe. There were multiple factors to this historical change. One factor was the environment. People were just more sensitive. Societies were more sensitive to ecology. Even the big infrastructural works already in the 70s, 80s started to be reconsidered. Even the big delta works in Holland were adapted to put less damage on the estuary. The second reason was hydrological, very concretely. There were several big floods in 1990s along the Rhine and along the Rhone, and hydrologically it just seemed impossible to raise the dikes again, simply because it was just physically very difficult to raise the dikes from meters and meters and make them wider and wider. There was a fourth reason, which is not very known, but I think very important, and it was economic. The political powers, which were paying billions and billions to make higher levees and stronger levees and more dams, started to realize actually that the higher the dams were, the more risk there was behind the dam, and that they were extremely costly investments, and that the investment was actually higher than what was protected behind the levee. And that was a quite important turn, is that politicians even started to realize that infrastructure, defensive infrastructure, in a sense of strong control or definitely final control, was actually too expensive. And the final factor which played was also the urban quality, that all the places which were actually the most attractive, the riversides, the coasts, were being turned into infrastructures, and infrastructures are not per definition places where you want to live on. So these four factors combined somehow into a historical moment, and that paved the way for a big change where all the countries, and you see it little extracts from the press or from reports, where the word space, espace in French or Ruimte in Dutch, Platz or Raum in Germany, about at the same time all Europe started to think differently on water management and flood management. And this is a question I've been investigating more particularly as a researcher at the ETH Zurich. And I've been studying more specifically 6 projects which range from 100 million euros to 2 billion euros. So it's quite a wide range, pretty heavy projects. They range from high in the Alps to low minus something in Holland. And they are on 4 different countries, Switzerland, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And they have one common thing, is that they are all being built. I think it's also very important, even if I like planning and teaching, it's sometimes very important to see what works and what doesn't work, and how these projects actually developed, and what were the success factors. So all had in common the fact that they were making more space for rivers, and making more space in places where the space is actually already occupied, which is the case in the whole West European territories. There is no more free space. And I'll go very quickly through this project. The principle of some of them were kind of what I call fused landscapes, so landscape which somehow behave totally normally. This is a landscape near Grenoble where you have a highway, you have little houses in the plain, you have levees and a bit of suburban sprawl, and in between you have a river and farmland. And what happens there is very simple. The city decided to lower the levee on 16 places, and this landscape becomes a flood landscape, so a flood designed by humans, only statistically about every 30 years. And this has turned the valley, which you saw previously as a 3D rendering. This is actually now the space which is made available for the river, statistically every 25 years. So basically what should be a catastrophe and drown everybody is actually turning into a relatively normal seasonal event. And this has been made possible by a negotiation with the farmers who allowed the city somehow to rent their fields when flood happens, provided they would receive compensation. Some of the works were also, as you see here, one of the principles was also to reopen all the pieces of forest that had been separated and isolated from the main riverbed. And here you see one of these pieces of forest being reintegrated into the riverbed. A second project is the Overdiepse polder, which was gained onto a floodplain already in the high Middle Ages. The polder is here again reopened to flood, here about every 25 years. This allows, filling the polders with water allows for lowering the water level up until 30 kilometers upstream, and that's so this landscape, which seems to be a rural landscape, is actually functioning for urban area of Den Bosch, which is located 30 kilometers upstream. And I think that's an important dimension, but we see that these open landscapes, when they are into a metropolitan settings here in the Netherlands, have to work together. City and landscape have to work together to provide safety. What happened here is that the farms were relocated onto little hills, just like 2,000 years ago. And you see here one of these farms which had been built 5 or 4 years ago onto one of these hills. And all these fields are now officially flood fields. The Noordwoud polder, very close by, is a little bit more complex since there are several things. There are the same principle of safety polders with higher farms, principle of creeks, tidal creeks, which let the tides come in and out again, and that's mostly for the ecological value of the water and the nature. And in the middle, a new channel has been opened that can be used as a bypass. So when the main river is too high, it goes through the bypass straight to the sea. Here you see the plan that shows you this is the areas that have been reclaimed very slowly from the Middle Age till 1960s. And this is now what's happening. In the middle, you have a bypass where the water from the river Merwede can flow through straight to the sea. And here you see a picture taken into this bypass with the road which has been lowered so that the water can go over the road. A little bit more urban, Meerstad, and not Maastad, sorry for the title. Meerstad literally means Lakeville, lake city. It is the city of Groningen in the north of Netherlands that started this project actually in the 1980s, talking about the time which is needed to make a project. Around the 1980s, the city realized that they were losing their inhabitants, and especially losing the richest inhabitants, because they wanted to have a house and a big garden and live in the countryside. So the city wondered, how can we keep the wealthiest part of our population and save our landscape from unlimited sprawl? And exactly at the same time, there were several little floods in the region, and the water board realized we need space for water. And since it's a small community, the water board and the city discussed together, probably in a bar or somewhere in the city, because they know each other. And they thought, well, let's make a project together and try to combine water safety and combine urban densification, but a certain type of densification that makes space for quality living. And together they managed to make a project, hired designers, I was one of them at the time, and defined a water landscape that makes space for very exclusive islands with little houses. Every house has his own little harbor to bring the boat. The lake on the long term should be 600 hectares. That's good for about 50 million cubic meters storage. So it's good for the city. And it should be good also for about 8,000 dwellings, which for the city of Groningen is a lot. And it offers different typologies of building, living at the sea, at the lake, living on the lake, etc. Here you see the islands, one of the islands being built in the middle of the winter. It's all very frozen, but it looks actually very nice when you see it in the spring. So that's one of the islands with the sailing harbors. The last example, which I think relates more to the urban condition, is the example of the Isar River in Germany, in Munich. The Isar River had already a floodplain, but which was designed in the 19th century in a very strict way. It was basically just a technical space where the river could flow over, and the mainstream was limited from the floodplain by a wall, just a 3-meter wall between water and land. So not a very rich place for urban leisure, not a very rich place for landscape, and not very rich for ecology. What the city did first was to actually clean the water. And I see the discussion plays here too. The first thing the city did was already in the 90s, basically paying the communities living upstream for building cleaning plants. And that was the first realization that the urbanites of Munich realized that if they wanted clean water, they had to discuss with people who were working and living 30, 50 kilometers upstream. And they actually financially helped them to clean the water. And then this clean water made it possible again to reconnect the water and the land, to change the contour of the river, to have more diversity, to have stones in the river, to have lower depths where people and even children can go and play in the water, and still to have something which still works as a floodplain. When there's a flood in Munich, this looks like a battlefield. Trees go over, rocks roll, but then a week later it is back again as an urban park. Here you see the shape that was defined in the 19th century. You see the shape of the river today. And you see a picture here of this same space last year on a hot summer, knowing that this space only on a hot weekend can receive about 30,000 people in the middle of the city center. You don't see it because it's a lot of trees, but this is exactly in the middle of the city of Munich. So, in total, what you see through this study is that there are many, many ways to reconnect water management and urban planning. There are different tools, the recreation of a floodplain, the creation of a bypass, like in Holland, combining construction with retention, reincorporating forest into the summer bed, into the winter bed, creation of the temporary flood fields, or sometimes very closely transforming the urban edges. But this study wants to be also more than just inventory of possible solution. I also went through all the planning process to understand what made actually some projects fast and efficient, and why some other projects were very slow and took 20, 30 years to be realized. And we all know it, that's the main problem. It's a problem personally, because you wonder when you make a project, will I still be alive when it's going to be built? Which can be a bit an anxious question. But it's also a global political problem. How long do we take, and can we speed it up, and can we make sure that the project don't stop abruptly because the conditions change? So we need to combine finally the time of design, the time of investment, the time of developers who want money back quickly. We want to combine this with the time of politicians who want to be re-elected in 5 years or 7 years, and the time of landscape. And the time of the landscape is a slow time, just like the time of growing trees, the time of climate change, so very slow paces. If I have the time, I think so. I didn't check the time, but I would like to show you 2 design experiments, which were not built, but which were made in an academic setting. And I think I would love to share the experiment, because I think we both, also in Sao Paulo, I see you experiment a lot with students, with research, and I think it's a very important part of our work. And one of these experiments actually interfered with reality, and that's also an interesting experience. I'm talking about this project Sillon-sur-Rhône in Switzerland. The other program is in Dordrecht, at the other end of the catchment area. Sillon was actually called Sillon, a city in Switzerland, and I proposed to call it Sillon-sur-Rhône, like Sillon upon the Rhône, just to remind people that they were actually living along the river and not just living in the mountains. So that was the first philosophical twist. It is exactly the typical history of European river. We have a fluctuating river in an alpine valley. We have little villages and towns implemented on the foothill, and 100 years later we have a straightened channel, and we have a valley which is basically full of houses, industry, airports, highways, etc., etc. That's somehow the typical story. And of this landscape which we reconstructed. So here you see the Rhône River, which used to occupy about 70% of the valley. And here you see the Rhône River, which is actually here, which occupies now about 5% of the valley, and the rest is mining, agriculture, highway, railway, local airport, local roads, and urbanization, which occupies about 95% of the space. So clearly, some have lost and some have gained. The consequence is that the river has been squeezed into a very narrow channel, but levees have been heightened again and again, and the levees are now about 5 meters high. And the consequence is that the riverside is one of the poorest, saddest, ugliest places in the city, where you basically concentrate towers of social housing, while all the happy, richer people can live on the hill with a view. And we also thought this is also a serious social and economical challenge to make this place attractive again, and eventually to allow developers to make money again also on this place. And what happened also in the year 2000 is that people realized that the levees were so high that when there was one little breach in the levee, it was suddenly and very quickly a lot of water pouring from the river. And this is what happened just downstream from the capital, just a few kilometers from the capital of the region. And this was a kind of shock that woke up a lot of people. This led to a big program. The Federation launched a program called the Third Correction of the Rhône, allowed for a budget of about 2.3 billion Swiss francs, which would be, I think, about 700 million, about 6 billion real, I think. So mostly federal money. And basically, the people locally wanted to make stronger levees and just keep business as usual. And the federation basically refused and said, we only give you the money if you make more space for the river, because we don't want to come again in 10 years and spend again more billions at the next flood. So we want a sustainable solution, and then we'll pay for it. So it came to the question of making space for the river and making space for ecology with a very happy world, space for birds, space for river, and it quickly became a very infrastructural program, which was not so happy. And basically what the people said, mostly planners, engineers, but what they said is, well, okay, we're in the city, we dredge the riverbed, and in the countryside, we make space for the river, which was somehow the most obvious answer. But the result was that people in the city were frustrated because the project didn't bring any added value to the city. People in the countryside were very angry because they were basically paying for the city, and that was the reality. So at the end, everybody was angry, and they started a war. Farmers dumped some cow shit, sorry for the expression, in front of the city hall. Urbanites were just ignoring the project and not interested. And this is when somehow we arrived as an academy saying, oh, well, we just come from the other side of the country. Can we use your city as a playground and make a design experiment? And because we were coming from far away, speaking a different language, from Zurich, coming to a French-speaking part of Switzerland, they let us play somehow, and we arrived with our topographic tools, trying to think of the watershed, use this same terrain data to think of what the section of the city could be and the environment of the city. Try to think of how time and scale were playing, the time between the ancient landscape and the inhabited landscape, and scale of water. How does water react and plays with the topography? Work with the local hydrology engineer, which you see here, and bring them in direct contact with the student groups. And then think of the time of history. What is the history of a city? The history of Sion was that originally it was just one little main street onto a hill going down to the Rhone. The first modernity was when the train came, but Sion built a new square in front of the station, an avenue, and a new square in front of the city hall. And what we proposed is to say, well, it's now the third modernity, and the third modernity is that Sion has grown out of about 500%, and the only public space you can build that has meaning for everybody is the river itself. And then the student proposed to transform the channel of the Rhone into a major central element in the city by reconnecting the Rhone with all the public space, and by creating a new channel of a bypass for the river and a new urban island in the middle, which was very radical and somehow shocking a bit. But also with the images that were produced, the studio showed that there was space to make new urban fronts, to improve the existing levee, to build at the river and not just behind the levee, and also outside of the city to build new leisure space and recreation space that could benefit also for the whole city. And that this proposal was not just a dream of architect, but was something that could be also very specifically and precisely implemented into a terrain model. We also created pictures that were a bit, I think, a bit commercial, but well, why not? We wanted to convince people that Sion could become also a water city and not just a mountain city, and this picture actually had a lot of success. It ended up in the national news with a full page on the news, and the city was so enthusiastic at the end about the idea that they asked us to make an exhibition in the floodplain, which is ironically, and they also subsidized a publication. And eventually, last year, they launched the international consultation of urban design, which is being constructed now, where the river edge is being transformed, a new urban program is being implemented along the river, public space are being built, a vast cultural center is going to be built where the mining site was, at the river directly. So this, what was meant as an experiment, a bit abstract experiment, really had a strong impact on the reality. This second, this process of dealing with reality somehow is something we went further with in Holland, so in the lowest country of Europe, on the city of Dordrecht, which is located on an island exactly at the border between the Rotterdam conurbation and the delta area, where basically half the waters of Europe flows through. Like they say in Dutch, Dordrecht has water until the lips, and not just once in a while, but very often, waters that comes over the riverbanks. With rising waters, clearly this is becoming a very dangerous situation. And on the south side, you see the main levee of the estuary. Their water doesn't go over it, but you see the spatial quality is, I would say, just as the land -5. It is less than quality, it is just a border. People cannot even walk over the levee to go to the other side. It blocks the view, and it's treated just like an infrastructure. So here again, our students were asked to give a vision of how this large urban landscape could meet and embrace this large delta landscape, and at the same time make a long-lasting safety belt for the city. And they came with a proposal where the levee was transformed into a real landscape, into a park that could be linked to the city parks. They make different proposals to use agriculture also as a buffer between nature and city, and showed that the interface between flood space and protected space could be also itself a beautiful space, a space of promenade, of enjoyment, and a space of transition between dense urban settings, agriculture, and nature space. But these parks could be also create new relations to water and to transportation eventually. We also asked the students to make scenarios, so not just to define a black and white situation where one space would be floodable, the other wouldn't be, but we asked them actually to be, okay, what is flooded often, what is flooded sometimes, what should never be flooded, so to put the students also in a situation of think of nature as something which is dynamic, but not something which is only dangerous or only nice, which is a bit somehow the archetypical idea we find in very often. So we asked them to draw gradients, to draw different shades of green and different shades of danger. So to sum it up, I think all these experiments and research have led me to certain conclusions. First, that if we want to deal with space and water at the same time, we need to think of risk redistribution. There is risk anyway. There will always be risk. There will always be a natural dynamic. So the issue is not to come down to zero risk. We will never get there. But is to come down to where do we put the risk? Do we put a bit more here or a bit less there? And how do we compensate people? We can't just spread the risk onto farmers and to save the city. So we need to negotiate. And that's the interesting thing, I think, of water management. It is a negotiation practice. The second issue is combined solution. We don't have the space anymore to have to dedicate areas only to water or only to urbanization or only to leisure. We need to combine these things just because we have used already all the space we had, at least in Western Europe. The third success factor is that local interventions are needed for global effect. This is a bit a cliché, I would say, in planning, but it's really what worked the best in the Dutch Room for the River program. Like I told you, the Swiss program was initially a centralized program, and it took 25 years. The Dutch program was a decentralized program, and it took 12 years. That's the time you gain when you actually incorporate local people straight from the beginning of the process. The fourth success factor is that we need to change our goals and our values. And that sounds a bit vague, but it is, I think, when we design public space, which are also space for fluctuation and for water, we need not only to find in terms of aesthetics, but to redefine these aesthetics. In particular, openness is very important. Water space, where very long space is closed for people. And actually what you see is that when space is closed for people, people just forget about it. And when they forget about it, they don't want to pay for it because we are just totally ignorant of what's happening behind the levee. So we need actually to open these spaces of danger when they are not dangerous, preferably, but to keep people in contact with the natural fluctuation. Of course, these spaces need to be robust, needs to be strong, to be able to sustain a flood and to be still in good shape afterwards. So that should also change our way to plant, our way to build. And we need to be coherent. We need to create a coherent space with urban and natural spaces. And finally, this idea of design as a negotiation platform. But design is not just the result of a linear trajectory. It's not going from A to B, and it is actually a process. And generally, what I realize more and more is that when we make design, we make scenarios, we make variations, we make options, and we talk about these options with everybody. And we tell people, you can choose for this or that. And we try to work together onto a negotiation platform where we are still somehow in charge of bringing the ideas, but we are not the only one in charge of decision-making, clearly, which has never been such, anyway. So I will just conclude on a bit of a question and maybe opening for discussion. The question is, where do we stand now today? We live in a certain landscape which are inherited from 150 or 200 years of engineering. And we somehow see that the question of natural risk is very interdependent of the question of planning. And how do we change our living space? This is a picture I took in Paris in June, so just a few months ago. And we know Paris is waiting for the 1st-century flood, and the previous 1st-century flood was in 1910. So basically we are already 6 years overdue, meaning there will be a major flood in Paris, very, very, very probably, in the coming years. Along the river, you have the presidential palace, you have the ministers, you have the embassies, so basically the whole France is paralyzed if there's a major flood. So how do we deal with this? Clearly, we cannot deal with that only in Paris. We need to think at a wider scale, much bigger, and we need to think of a metropolitan scale and a regional scale. And you could think that's a question of big money, but this flood in June has cost already €1 billion in damage. Think of what project could have been done with €1 billion if we didn't have to wait for the catastrophe to react. So the issue cannot be just to build more walls. I think walls are, well, it's a bit an American obsession at the moment, but we cannot we can't keep hiding the problem behind higher levies, which will break at some stage. So I would rather finish my conference on a picture of Munich, which I think is a very fascinating ways to combine space for water, space for leisure, space for urban life, and this in the middle of a city. Since I think the issues of sustainability is a paradox somehow, because when you think sustainable, you think long-lasting, and I think somehow the solutions that will be long-lasting will be solutions that are flexible. So we need more elasticity, we don't need more control, we need more elastic landscapes. Thank you. Obrigado.